Hey guys, tonight we begin with the hush of two worlds divided by walls, but not by sleep. In one, a fire sighs beneath carved stone, warming velvet blankets and the heavy breath of a king turned on his side. In the other, wind whistles through, warped wood, and a man beneath hay shifts his aching bones, chasing warmth in silence. And yet, both dream. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing, only if it feels right. Let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? Somewhere between these two worlds lies a crust of bread. On the king's table it is discarded for softer fare. In the peasant's hands it is supper, breakfast, and blessing. Yet both have known hunger in their own way, one of the belly, the other of the heart. The castle breathes differently than the barn. One exhales privilege, perfumed with beeswax and roast goose. The other draws in the scent of wet straw and boiled cabbage, of leather boots never fully dry. But if you listened closely, neither place was without its creaks, its groans, its small nightly confessions. Outside, the wind knows no rank. It touches gold and mud the same. A wolf howls, distant and unbothered by crowns or crusts. A servant refills the king's goblet. A child in the village coughs in her sleep. This was medieval Europe, a place where roles were carved deeper than stone. But nights softened everyone. In the dark, hierarchy blurred. In the cold, everyone pulled the blanket a little tighter. And that is where we begin. Not in the pages of a history book, but in the shared silence between royalty and ruin, in flickering candlelight and the quiet ache behind closed eyes, in moments so small they were never written down, yet meant everything. So settle in, because what follows is not the story of kings or peasants, but of both. Together, apart, equal only in sleep. And as the frost curls beneath the doorframe, we begin, where warmth and want live side by side. The ground was never truly dry, not in the village, not in the alleyways between thatched roofs, where children's bare feet sank with every step, and the earth clung like a second skin. It was a kind of mud that didn't wash off, not entirely. It softened soles, browned hems, and crept into the straw laid carefully by tired hands. It was both enemy and blanket, damp, yes, but familiar. There, on that same ground, a woman leaned, into her broom of bundled reeds. She swept not to cleanse, but to clear a path through the wet, tamped dirt floor of her home. Each push was slow. Not because she was lazy, but because nothing in the village rushed. Not meals, not footsteps, not the rain. Only hunger had urgency. Far away in a world higher by more than just walls, marble gleamed beneath the slippers of someone important. It echoed when he walked, even alone. The polished floor was not just cold to the touch, it was cold on purpose. Clean, hard, untouched by the same filth that warmed the peasant's toes. Here dirt was a threat, there it was insulation, and yet both buildings had their leaks. The cottage leaked at the corners where the roof sagged like tired shoulders, and the walls exhaled a faint must of mold and history. The castle leaked too, but in whispers, through spies, cracks in loyalty, and the slow drip of truth behind tapestries. The peasant family never paused to curse the mud. It was simply part of things, like hunger, like nightfall, like the spoon that was never quite full, but was always passed around. Mud didn't stain their dignity. It was their dignity. It proved they'd endured something that their feet had walked, that they had a place to return to, even if the roof sometimes sighed in disappointment. In the palace, servants cleaned the same spotless corners again and again, not because they were dirty, but because someone might look. Appearances mattered, more than comfort. In fact, comfort was often the first thing sacrificed to make beauty possible. Out in the fields, the soil was wet with more than rain. Sweat darkened collars. Fingernails wore crescents of black under their ridges. Children dug through the softened earth for roots and beetles, not for play, but to see what else the land might give. The land was stingy, but sometimes, when no one was watching, it gave enough. Back in the castle, a window was open to air out the tapestries. A cool breeze crept in, too cold for the dog curled at the noble's feet. But no one asked the dog. He simply shivered and watched his master sip wine older than the fields ever were. And yet, the noble stared out the window the same way the farmer stared at his field, hoping for something to change. A better yield, a softer wind, fewer troubles. When it rained in the village, people tilted their buckets beneath the eaves, catching what they could. When it rained on the castle, the water was diverted unseen, channeled away through hidden stone veins built long ago. Both listened to the patter, one for water, one for mood. At night, the peasant would wash his feet in a cracked bowl, not for cleanliness, but to warm them with motion. The king would soak his hands in rosewater, the scent rising like a prayer, but neither man, no matter how elevated, could scrub the ache from his bones. And when they knelt, whether to the sky, to the soil, or to some stained glass saint, the ground was still beneath them, the same earth, the same weight. Some say the king ruled by divine right, the peasant by divine patience. Even stones remember things. The marble remembers footsteps heavy with purpose, secrets whispered between courtiers, blood spilled in silence. The mud remembers laughter through cracked teeth, lullabies sung beside a dying fire, the hush of knees pressed into prayer. Mud doesn't gleam, it doesn't echo, but it holds you. One hardens, the other yields, one reflects, the other absorbs, and still both build homes, and as the night deepens, both marble and mud cool beneath moonlight, equal now, quiet now, waiting for morning, just like them. The morning did not arrive with ceremony. It crept in quietly, through cracks in the wall, through the breath of animals still sleeping, through the ache that never fully left a peasant's back. It arrived not with bells or servants, but with cold. In the village, breakfast was not a meal. It was a ritual of necessity. A pot sat near the embers, not quite cold, not quite warm. Its contents were grey, not yet porridge, not yet disappointment. A child stirred it slowly with a wooden spoon. Its handle darkened from many mornings just like this one. The mother rubbed her palms together, not to clean them, but to feel something. Warmth, readiness, life. She ladled the thick paste into bowls that didn't match, bowls that were chipped, that clinked too loudly in the morning stillness. No one spoke. Not yet. Elsewhere, not far in distance, but worlds apart in sound, a rooster crowed, and someone opened a velvet curtain with gloved fingers. The room did not need the sun, but it welcomed it anyway. Gold leaf shimmered on the walls. A servant entered, not with a question, but with a silver tray. The bread was soft and white, its crust delicate. There were figs already peeled, cheese carved with absurd precision, and wine poured as if the day had already earned it. Someone of importance blinked into the morning light and reached for a grape. No one was hungry, not truly. But eating was expected. In the cottage the porridge was salted, sparingly, a luxury. The salt had been traded for something once, maybe an egg, maybe a promise. They never used too much. Not because they were thrifty, but because they remembered. One child fidgeted. Another scraped the side of the bowl with practiced grace. The youngest was fed by hand, a spoon offered again and again, no coaxing, no complaint. Hunger spoke louder than words. The nobleman chewed with leisure, his jaw lazy. He glanced at a letter folded on the table, its wax seal still intact, but already heavy with consequence. The food had taste, yes, but no warmth. Not the kind that came from across a shared wooden bench. Not the kind passed between cracked hands. The castle's dining hall was not meant for intimacy. It was meant for display. A man sitting at one end might nod toward someone at the other and call it conversation. But in the village, a hand on a shoulder or a quiet sigh between bites said more. Sometimes the peasant's family had nothing, not even porridge. On those mornings, they chewed on silence, sipped hot water, and called it tea. The children still sat in their places. The spoon still stirred something. The routine mattered. In the palace, breakfast could be moved, delayed, or replaced. A noble might decide he wasn't hungry after all. A dog would receive what he left untouched. A servant would carry the tray away and say nothing. But in the hut, every spoonful meant something. The smells were different, too. The peasant's fire offered wood smoke and boiled grain, a perfume of survival. The noble's room smelled of beeswax and imported spices. But neither smell told the truth, not fully. Because even the softest breakfast can be eaten with clenched teeth. The child in the village licked the bowl, not greedily, just thoroughly. A habit of hope, a ritual learned. She looked up and smiled, porridge on her chin. Her mother wiped it away with her sleeve. In the castle no such mess was allowed. A crumb fallen was a sin. Napkins folded into roses, cutlery aligned with military precision, and yet no one smiled at the table. Sometimes the noble dreamed of other food, not richer, not finer, just simpler. He couldn't say why. A crust pulled from a fire, a bowl held with both hands. Something real. Meanwhile, the peasant woman glanced toward the pot. Tomorrow's breakfast was not promised, but she had oats, she had patience, and she had a child who licked the bowl. Outside, morning light filtered through a thatched roof and through stained glass alike. Dust danced in both places, golden and indifferent, and in both places the day began. Not with trumpets or declarations, but with the quiet clink of a spoon, and the soft hunger of another day survived. There were walls that held out armies and walls that couldn't hold out the wind. The castle's walls were thick enough to silence screams. Stone stacked on stone, sealed with pride and mortar. Each block had been touched by a mason, kissed by sweat, and laid in place with the intent to last centuries. They stood with the arrogance of permanence. The peasants' walls, by contrast, were timber and mud, woven branches smeared with daub, patched with clay, horsehair, straw, whatever the earth could spare and the hands could shape. These walls didn't pretend to be forever. They just needed to last the winter. In the village, a gust could rattle the entire house. It slipped beneath the door, hummed through the gaps, and caressed bare ankles like an unwelcome ghost. The wind didn't knock. It came in laughing. But the walls were not without their charm. They were warm in their own way. Not because they trapped heat well, but because they held stories. Scratches on the beam where a child once measured her height, a fingerprint in the dried clay, the soft dark smudge where a back had leaned night after night as the fire burned low. In the castle, tapestries hung from the walls, thick, expensive. Ones not for beauty, though they were beautiful, but for warmth, because even stone shivers in February. A noble's chamber might have a fire, but the walls never let you forget that outside was cold, and that stone remembers the chill long after the sun has gone. A servant once whispered, while smoothing out a fur throw, that you couldn't buy warmth, you could only borrow it. The noble did not respond, but he pulled the blanket closer. In the cottage, warmth came in bursts, a kettle boiling, a child pressed close, a dog curled up behind someone's knees. There were no tapestries, only patched fabric hung to block the draught. And yet the space between people was smaller. The walls made of mud seemed to pull them closer, made them sit shoulder to shoulder, made silence feel like safety. The castle had doors that groaned and echoed. They opened into halls so wide your own footsteps followed you. There was privacy, yes, but loneliness often came with it. The sound of your own breath could feel like a stranger's. The cottage door was a plank of wood, uneven, hinged with iron so tired it shrieked when it moved. But every creak was familiar. Every sound had been heard before. That door didn't open to a hall. It opened to the sky, to smoke, to chickens, to neighbors. When storms came, the castle's walls stood firm. Rain pelted them, wind cursed them, but nothing moved. Inside, a noble might read a letter by candlelight, the outside world merely a muffled suggestion. But in the village, storms were intimate. Rain became music on the thatch. Wind became voice in the chimney. Thunder made everyone pause mid-sentence. They didn't fear the storm, they made room for it, covered the hearth, moved the children, waited. And when the storm passed, it left the castle unchanged, untouched, still. But the cottage shifted a little. Mud smeared new places. The roof lost a reed or two, and someone muttered, "We'll fix it after the frost." The noble touched stone and felt power. The peasant touched their wall and felt memory. Both felt cold. One owned his house, the other built hers by hand. One's warmth was silent, the other's was shared. And the wind, faithful, fearless wind, knew the truth of both. Some hands commanded armies. Others dug turnips from frozen ground. In the castle, hands were smooth, pale, perfumed, adorned with rings that shimmered like still water. They were hands that gestured more than they grasped, hands that pointed, signed scrolls, poured wine into silver cups, not because they were thirsty, but because the moment asked for it. In the cottage, hands were a different story, thick with callus, fingertips split, nails short and darkened with the stubborn soil of daily life. They did not point, they pulled. They didn't rest, they remembered. A woman's hands smoothed the same blanket each night, patching it with pieces of old shirts, old lives. A man's hands gripped a plough even when it splintered. A child's. Hands knew how to sweep ashes, hold a younger sibling, carry a bucket too heavy for their age. There was no praise for these hands, no feast in their honor. But the bread on the table, the fire still burning, that was their legacy. The noble's hand rested on a scepter, cool to the touch, symbolic, heavy only with meaning, not with effort. And yet he too sometimes stared at his fingers in the quiet of early morning, wondering if they had ever truly made anything. He could write his name. But could he mend a shoe? Could he shear a sheep? Could he pull a tooth with nothing but courage and a hot knife? In the village, a grandmother pulled thread through cloth with a needle curved by age. Her hands shook, but not from weakness. They simply remembered too much. Winters, wounds. The time she caught a chicken with nothing but a basket and a prayer. There was no coin in those hands. But there was history. The king's hands received tribute. The peasant's hands offered soup to someone hungrier than they were. And when pain came, both reached out. One for a healer, one for another hand. A noble might stretch his hand toward a servant to be gloved before a feast. A peasant mother might wrap her hands around her child's toes at night, warming them with her own skin. The gesture was the same, an offering of care. The texture was different. Even in death, hands told. The truth. The nobles were folded, manicured, draped in silk. The peasants were still dirty, still clenched, as if still holding on to something that mattered. There was irony in it, that the same 5 fingers could build a wall or sign a war, could brush hair from a child's eyes or raise a flag to summon death. But it wasn't the task that shaped them. It was the silence between tasks. The choices no one saw, the way they rested or trembled or reached when no one asked them to. Some hands ruled, others remembered, and when winter came, both pressed themselves closer to the fire, hoping they had done enough. Cleanliness was not just rare, it was almost imaginary. In the village, the idea of a bath came and went like summer thunder, talked about, hoped for, but never truly expected. There was water, of course, but it was cold, always cold, drawn from a distant well or caught in buckets from the sky. It shimmered in metal pots, waiting to be warmed by coals that were already promised to supper. There was no bathtub, no tiled room. Just a wooden basin cracked at the rim, brought out only when someone was sick, or when spring arrived with a rare mercy. The mother would pour water from a ladle, slowly. The child would squirm, not from heat, but from the shock of it. A single rag did the work of soap, sponge, and towel. Then the water was saved, because it could not be wasted. Perhaps it would clean the floor tomorrow. Perhaps a younger sibling would sit in it next. In the castle, baths were something else entirely. A copper tub, gleaming, steam curling like perfume, petals floating on the surface, not to cleanse but to flatter. Servants brought the water up bucket by bucket, careful not to spill. A noble sat in silence while others scrubbed, as if dirt was an insult rather than an inevitability. But, even then, no one was truly clean. The peasant's skin bore the marks of soot, soil, and labor. The nobles bore powders and perfumes, but underneath there was the same sweat, the same ache. Some said peasants didn't bathe because they were ignorant. But the truth was simpler. Warmth was too precious. Fire was for cooking, water was for living. And even if there had been time, where would one hide to undress? The village was close, too close. Everyone knew everyone's secrets. Dirt was less shameful than nudity, less dangerous than exposure, and besides, filth had its uses. It kept the wind off, it thickened the skin. Lice preferred the clean anyway. In noble halls, the notion of filth was theatrical. They spoke of purity, yet walked halls that reeked, of chamber pots and wine spilled in corners. Servants scrubbed until their knuckles bled, and still mice danced in the pantry. One might be anointed with oil, the other smeared with pig fat to keep the cold away. But both walked into their nights, coated in something they did not ask for. When illness came, baths were suddenly remembered. Water was heated with urgency. Herbs were added not for scent, but in desperate hope. Fever did not respect silk or sackcloth. It stripped everyone to the bone. Still, some found a kind of peace in the dirt. A child with mud between their toes did not feel poor. A man with soot on his arms felt warmed by it. They did not long for baths because they did not know them. You cannot miss what you've never touched. But the noble, sitting in his scented tub, sometimes sighed as if the water could wash away something deeper, loneliness perhaps, or fear, things that clung tighter than grime. A peasant woman once whispered, as she wiped her face with a damp cloth, "God doesn't mind a little dirt." She believed it, had to. The bath never came. Not the one from stories, not the one from dreams, but hands were rinsed, faces were wiped, children were kissed clean, and that was enough. In the castle, the bath was grand, but afterward they still shivered. The chill still found its way in. Warm water turned cold, no matter how many petals floated, and at the end of it all, both bodies, rich and poor, returned to the same earth. Dirt welcomed them both. So whether you soaked in lavender or washed in silence, the truth remained. The bath never truly came, only the will to carry on, with or without it. The table was never just a table. It was a mirror of the world, of who had and who did not. In the castle, the table groaned beneath abundance. Platters of meat, glistening and steaming, loaves stacked like bricks of pride, fruits from far-off lands, dishes so delicate they collapsed at the touch of a silver spoon, food as spectacle, as power, as proof. A noble sat with practiced posture, tearing bread, not because he was hungry, but because others were watching. A feast was a performance. To eat well was to be seen. In the village there was a table too, smaller, crooked, repaired more than once with twine and prayer. Upon it sat a single bowl, maybe two, a crust of bread that had been softened in broth, a few onions. A spoon passed. Between hands no one watched, no one needed to. Here eating was not a ritual of display, but of survival. You ate quietly, gratefully, and sometimes not at all. Hunger had its own language. It made people fold inwards, speak in shorter sentences, glance at the pot long after it had been emptied. Children learned early how to chew slowly, to savor, to pretend. In the great hall a bard might sing while nobles raised goblets and tore into roasted birds. Fingers glistening, mouths full, laughter rising like steam. Servants swept through like ghosts, refilling, replacing, removing. The table was never still. But hunger can visit a king too, just differently. It whispers not of food, but of control, of unrest, of the fear that someday the feast may end and no one will bring the tray again. The peasant's hunger was simpler, sharper. It gnawed at the ribs. It made sleep thin and the morning feel too far away. It made turnips precious. A bean in the bottom of a pot, a treasure. A mother might say, "Eat slowly, let your stomach think it's full." And the child would nod, already learning how to fool their own body. In winter, when famine pressed down like a second sky, even crumbs became currency. A neighbor might share half a loaf, half of what they had, not out of wealth, but out of memory, because someone had once done the same for them. Meanwhile, in the castle, someone complained that the goose was too dry, that the wine was too sharp, that the table was too crowded. Feast does not always feed. Sometimes it fills the mouth, but not the heart. There were nights in the village when there was no food at all, just warm water and stories. The old ones would talk of better seasons, of berry bushes that once burst with color, of pigs so fat they couldn't walk. The children listened like it was a fairy tale. But even in the castle there were stories, told in lower voices, of empty storehouses, of taxes unpaid, of peasants growing restless. The king never starved, but he knew the taste of fear. A feast cannot protect you from that, and still the villagers sang. Around fires they sang. Songs with nonsense words and quiet harmonies. Songs that fed something deeper than the stomach. Joy made from nothing. Celebration not in spite of emptiness, but because of it. A noble once asked his servant why peasants laughed so much. The servant paused and said, "Because they have to. When a feast ends, scraps are thrown, bones discarded. A dog licks them clean." In the village, that same bone might boil for days, flavoring soup for a family of 6. Dignity was never found in what was eaten, but in how it was shared. And so, one table gleamed with gold, the other with grace. Both tables knew silence. One from fullness, the other from longing. But each night, beneath the same sky, hands folded over bellies, whether swollen with food or hollow with hunger, and sleep came all the same. The feast would fade. The hunger would pass, but the memory of both would stay. They were always there, behind the curtain, behind the door, behind the words that men spoke. Women, not named in the records, not carved in the stone, but woven into every thread of daily survival, like the straw that held up the roof, quiet, coarse, essential. In the village, a woman rose before the rooster, not to pray, not to read, but to work. She stirred the embers. She kneaded the dough. She woke the children with a whisper, never a shout. Her voice was soft, but not from gentleness, because there was no need to raise it. Everyone already knew what needed doing. She did not own the house, but she kept it standing. In the manor, a noblewoman sat in a high-backed chair, her hands resting in her lap like folded paper. She had learned how to speak without speaking, through glances, through pauses, through knowing when silence carried more weight than 100 words. Her life, too, was filled with duty, but it wore perfume. In the village, silence was not submission. It was strategy. It was the pause before the baby stirred, the stillness during a storm, the breath taken between a man's rage and a child's cry. Women there had no time for speeches. They had things to mend. A grandmother hummed while peeling potatoes, her voice barely above the breath of the fire. A daughter copied her movements without being told. And when they laughed, it was not loud, but it shook the air like wind through wheat. In the castle, women's voices were measured in volume and consequence. A comment overheard could birth a rumor. A look misplaced could close a door forever. Power was not taken, it was bartered. Silks traded for silence, access for obedience. Influence passed not through decree, but through dinner conversations and pillow talk. And yet both women, the peasant and the noble, had one thing in common. They were never still. Even while sitting, their hands moved. Shelling peas, stitching tears, braiding hair, writing letters they would never sign. Their labor did not shout. It whispered. When sickness came, it was a woman who noticed first. The color in the cheeks, the heaviness of limbs. She mixed herbs. She soaked cloths. She prayed with lips that never stopped moving. When the man collapsed, it was a woman who lifted his head. When the child sobbed, it was a woman who lay beside them, pretending not to hear, so they'd feel strong. There were stories they told one another that no man ever heard, recipes, remedies, warnings. There was a language in the way they passed bread, a whole conversation in the way one woman covered another with a blanket. In the fields, they bent their backs alongside men and then returned home to bend their backs again. No reward, no applause. But the world turned anyway, because they turned it. Even when joy came, it was quiet. A glance across the table, a finger running through a child's curls, a rare piece of fruit shared before anyone else awoke. And when grief came, it was held. Not spoken. A noblewoman might weep behind embroidered veils, a peasant woman into her apron. But both carried sorrow the same way. Under the ribs, behind the smile, beneath the skin. They were not the authors of history, but they edited everything. They turned chaos into comfort, hunger into ritual, mud into home. No monument stands for them. No song bears their names, but every time bread rises or a child laughs or a wound is tended with steady hands, there they are, not silent at all, only listening. It's easy to assume that the castle was warm, that behind the walls of stone, and under the embroidered ceilings, comfort wrapped itself around royalty like a second skin. That the velvet robes, the fur-lined cloaks, the roaring hearths meant the cold stayed far away. But cold has a clever way of finding you, especially the kind that doesn't bite the fingers, but lingers in the chest. In the village, cold was honest. It blew straight through the door, crept under skirts, stiffened boots, and turned breath to fog. People knew when they were cold. They said it aloud. They huddled, cursed, layered. They burned anything that might burn. The air hurt, but it was a shared pain. In the castle it was different. The fire burned high, yes. Logs stacked like trophies, flames dancing for no one in particular. But there were nights, long echoing nights, when the cold was not in the room but in the heart of it. A king sat beside the hearth, wine untouched, eyes fixed on the flame. The warmth kissed his skin, but not his bones. His crown rested on the table, heavy even in its stillness. There was fur on his shoulders, gold at his feet, and still, he pulled the blanket higher. In the cottage, cold was a visitor. Familiar, annoying, expected. They prepared for it with straw stuffed into gaps, with pots of boiled stones placed under beds. A mother would press her feet against her child's, at night exchanging heat like coins. The body bent to survive. But in the castle, pride got in the way. No king would admit to shivering. No queen would confess that the fire no longer reached her toes. The rooms were too large, the ceilings too high. Heat disappeared into space, and silence returned in its place. A servant once whispered, while refilling the noble's cup, "It's the kind of cold that no fire fixes." The noble didn't answer. He simply nodded and watched the steam rise. Loneliness chills too, and power is a poor insulator. The villagers had each other. Their warmth came from closeness. 6 bodies beneath one blanket. A dog curled near the hearth, elbows brushing during supper. They didn't have privacy, but they had proximity. The king had rooms that no one entered without permission. He had advisors, guards, guests, but not nearness. And so the cold came in, not with wind, but with silence. A forgotten name. A look that lingered too long. The knowledge that affection was measured, calculated, strategic. He wore rings on every finger, but no hand ever held his without reason. In the village, a child would climb into bed between coughing fits, and no. One pushed them away. A baby's cry meant a mother's arm reached out, sleepy but immediate. In the castle, the cries were quieter, older, more restrained. No one heard them. Even the blankets were different. The peasant's quilt was patched from years of memory, scraps of old shirts, worn skirts, each square sewn in silence. It didn't cover much, but it held stories. The noble's coverlet was imported, feathered, dyed with crushed flowers and stitched by strangers. It covered everything, except the ache. One night, frost covered both windows. In the cottage, they laughed about it, drew pictures in the fog, told the children the cold couldn't find them if they stayed beneath the covers. It wasn't true, but it helped. In the castle, no one laughed. They merely shut the shutters tighter and added another log to the fire. The flame rose, but the chill remained. It is a strange truth that the more space one has, the colder it can feel. The peasants shared everything: space, breath, hunger, warmth. The nobles had everything, but shared little. And sometimes it is the sharing that keeps the cold away. So beneath all the velvet, beyond all the gold, the crown could not protect him from the cold, because it wasn't the wind that stung. It was the emptiness that followed. They laughed with their mouths full of mud, not out of disrespect, not out of ignorance, but because laughter was all they had left that wasn't taxed. In the village, the dirt got into everything. It clung to skin, caked onto hems, painted children's knees like bruises from the earth itself. You couldn't scrub it off, not entirely, and no one tried. Because if you stopped to worry about the dirt, you'd never get anything done. So they made peace with it. Then jokes, then joy. A boy slipped in the slop outside the cottage. His sister howled with laughter, even as she helped him up. The fall was nothing new, the stains expected. But the sound that followed, the belly-deep, eye-watering giggle, was golden. Inside the castle, dirt was an enemy. Servants scrubbed the floors with vinegar and cloths until they could see their own exhausted faces reflected back. A noblewoman once scolded her maid for dust she could not even see. In a place where image was everything, filth was betrayal. But outside the castle it was freedom. Laughter didn't wait for clean hands. It came suddenly, loudly, often at the worst times. During a funeral, when someone's stomach growled like a wolf. During chores, when a bucket cracked and splashed water across fresh-washed feet. During prayer, when the priest's voice cracked, just enough to make a child snort. They weren't laughing because life was easy. They were laughing because it wasn't. In the castle, humor had rules, timing, appropriateness. Laughter was polite, contained, sharp like a blade, used to elevate or cut down. But in the dirt, it was rounder, warmer, more forgiving. A peasant. Girl made faces at the moon. An old man with 2 teeth sang songs that made no sense. A mother tickled her baby's belly until both of them gasped for breath, cheeks red, tears of joy indistinguishable from the smoke of the hearth. The dirt caught their laughter and kept it, stored it like seeds, because even the ground understood how rare and precious it was. A noble, alone in his chamber, smiled only when spoken to. His lips practiced politeness more than delight. He had a jester once, someone paid to be funny, but jokes with a price never filled the chest the same way. No one paid the peasants to laugh. They just did. After the hardest days, after the harvest, failed, or the roof caved in, or the cow gave no milk, someone always managed to say something ridiculous. And someone always laughed, because to not laugh was to admit defeat. There was wit in the village, sharp as any sword. Sarcasm traded over bread, teasing like morning mist. A grandmother might call her soup noble stew and serve it with a proud smirk. A boy might puff out his chest and declare himself lord of the pig pen. They knew what they were, and that made it easier to pretend for a moment that they weren't. In winter, when the night stretched like aching limbs, they told stories. Some true, some not, all funny in the way only truth can be. There was one about a rooster who laid an egg, another about a man who mistook a boot for bread. None of them mattered, but all of them made the nights shorter. The dirt was part of it. You couldn't laugh that way on marble. It was too clean, too careful. But the ground forgave. It received your weight, your mess, your joy, and asked nothing in return. Even the animals understood. The dog barked with excitement when the children ran. The chickens squawked in alarm when someone danced in the yard. Everyone joined in, whether they meant to or not. In the castle, silence was mistaken for dignity, laughter for disruption. But in the village, laughter was proof that they were still human, still alive, still here. So when the baby was born with hair like a bird's nest, they laughed. When the soup spilled, they laughed. When the wind blew the door open for the 3rd time that night, they laughed. Because if they didn't, what else was there? In the castle, legacy was written in ink. The parchment was thick. The seal, pressed with a signet ring older than its bearer. Names were listed, titles traced, lands divided, lineages preserved in loops of cursive more elegant than honest. It was all very official. A noble's life was written down before he even lived it. Baptisms, coronations, marriages. Even his death had a plan. Who would mourn, how many bells would toll, what he'd wear when they lowered him beneath stone. In the village, there was no parchment, no pen, no seal, only memory. A child sat by the fire watching her grandmother peel turnips. The old woman spoke without looking up, her words soft, slow and deliberate. Stories not written, but spoken. About a winter when the snow came early. About the time the cow gave birth in the kitchen. About how the stars had shimmered differently when her first child was born. This was their record, oral, fragile, alive. It could vanish in an instant, but somehow it didn't. In the castle library, the books were bound in leather, stamped with gold. They held stories, laws, sermons, yet few of them remembered names like Elsa, who stitched her fingers bloody, or Luca, who saved seeds in a pouch around his neck. Those names lived only in the village. The noble could summon a clerk to write a decree, to immortalize a thought, to curse or pardon with a flourish of his hand. But in the village, they carved initials into trees, scratched dates into the backs of spoons, wove stories into blankets, stitched into corners only the family would recognize. They didn't call it legacy. They just called it living. A man died in his sleep, and his daughter placed his worn shoes by the door just as he always did. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. But the gesture was louder than any letter. The noble's tomb was etched in Latin, the peasant's grave marked with a stone and a handful of wildflowers. But both were remembered, one by books, the other by breath, and perhaps breath carries farther. Indeed, the castle legacy was guarded, protected from scandal, carefully shaped. An heir might be sent away to learn how to carry a name before he ever knew how to carry a child. In the village, legacy was passed in stories told while kneading dough, in the way a mother hummed while stirring stew. In the quiet way a son mimicked. His father's walk without knowing he was doing it. No one praised it. No one wrote it down, but it endured. Somewhere a noble commissioned a painting of himself in armor, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his posture impossibly proud. The artist added a sword, though the man had never wielded one. This too was part of legacy. Meanwhile, a woman in the village sang the same lullaby her mother had sung to her. The words had shifted over time, a syllable lost, a line added, but the feeling remained. There was no portrait, no signature, but that child would remember the melody when nothing else remained. Legacy is not always loud. It is not always preserved. Sometimes it's what survives in a laugh, a phrase, a gesture repeated by someone too young to remember where it came from. Sometimes it's the shape of a hand or the tilt of a head or a soup that always tastes a certain way. Sometimes it's just a name whispered by someone who still cares. And maybe that's enough. It was said the king sat above all, above the common folk, above the hunger, above the dirt, even perhaps above the rats. But the rats disagreed. In the palace, they scurried, behind walls embroidered with tapestries, behind the painted smiles of saints, through the cellars lined with wine, and beneath the feasts that rotted faster than they could be eaten. The nobility never saw them, not truly, but their maids did. Their cooks did. The boys who lit the torches at dusk did. In the village, rats were no secret. They rustled in the straw, nibbled at stored grain, climbed into cribs if you didn't guard them. You didn't pretend they weren't there. You chased them, trapped them, swore at them, and sometimes, in the leanest winters, you ate them. Survival makes philosophers of everyone. A rat in the castle feasted well. Cheeses from distant lands, drippings from pork glazed in honey, crumbs of sugared fruits. It had no name, no title, no fear. It moved as it pleased, its kingdom carved from silence. The king, for all his majesty, had none of that freedom. He couldn't slip through shadows or vanish into corners. His life was lit by candles he hadn't asked for, watched by men who bowed but never blinked. His throne was raised, but heavy. And cold. The rat's throne was warmer, a nest in a cupboard lined with linen stolen from a servant's apron, and still the king believed himself separate. But filth has no hierarchy. In the village, they knew this. Dirt found its way under fingernails, and lice behind ears. But no one lied about it. A child scratched his head in the open. A mother picked fleas from the baby's hair like it was just another chore, because it was. In the castle, they powdered it away, covered it with perfume, sprinkled lavender on the rugs and whispered about ill humors when someone itched. But the rats came anyway. They did not recognize crowns. They climbed rafters while oaths were sworn. They gnawed at floorboards beneath royal feet. They birthed their young in forgotten corners of forgotten rooms. There's a kind of poetry in that. A king, cloaked in velvet, giving orders to a man who cannot meet his eye. While beneath his chair, something chews softly at the wood, legacy and vermin side by side. In the village, children gave rats nicknames, threw pebbles at them, made games of chasing them from the pantry. There was no shame, just annoyance, just persistence. But in the castle, a single squeak could cause a panic. An infestation meant disgrace. Not just a nuisance, but a scandal. Because if even the king had rats, what did that say about the rest of the world? A man once said, "You can tell who's really in charge by what eats first." In the castle, the rat ate while the meat cooled. In the village, the rat waited for the fire to die. Then it crept in and took what the family couldn't finish. In both places, it survived. In both places, it thrived. In the palace, a noble died of plague. His name etched in stone. His funeral whispered through corridors as servants burned his linens. In the village, a boy died too. No stone, no hymn, just silence and a rat that kept its distance. For now, no one spoke of it. But they all knew. The rat had come from the castle, and so for all the gold, all the marble, all the power, death came the same way, on tiny feet, with quiet teeth, uninvited, unapologetic, and as the wind swept through both the high towers and the low barns, the rat paused only once on the stone step of a crumbling wall. It blinked and ran toward the smell of something warm. Sleep came differently to different people. In the castle, it arrived in silence. The bed was tall, so tall a stool was needed to reach it. Silk sheets tucked so tightly they might have been part of the bed itself. The mattress, stuffed with goose feathers, sank gently beneath the weight of royalty. Candles were snuffed, curtains drawn. A servant stepped backward through the door with a bow, careful not to let the chill in. And still, sleep did not always come. In the cottage, sleep came with noise. A baby's cough, the creak of beams swollen from rain, the distant howl of something with teeth. They didn't close the door to keep the cold out. They closed it to keep the warmth in. The bed was not a bed, not in the way most imagine it. It was a pile, of straw, of cloth, of old coats and patched quilts. It smelled of earth and bodies and smoke, but it was theirs. A child wriggled between siblings. A dog stretched out near someone's feet. A mother tucked a blanket beneath her husband's knees while he pretended not to notice. There was no privacy, but there was peace. Sometimes. In the castle, a noblewoman turned beneath her, canopy, eyes wide open. Her hair, unpinned and fanned across her pillow, glistened in the moonlight. Her thoughts refused to sleep. Too many things not said. Too many names carried on folded letters. Too many expectations pressing down like a second blanket. She had everything, except rest. In the village, a man snored so loudly his wife nudged him with her elbow. She muttered something under her breath, half curse, half blessing. He didn't wake. That was the beauty of exhaustion. When it came, it took everything they did not dream often. And when they did, it was mostly of food, of sun, of boots that didn't leak. But even dreams needed energy. There were nights when the children whispered to each other long after the fire went out, sharing secrets beneath the same scratchy wool, inventing stories that made the dark feel like a game. In the castle, silence ruled the corridors. Guards stood without blinking. Maids padded softly from room to room. And somewhere, a prince slept alone in a bed too large, his hand curled around the memory of being small. Sleep was not comfort, it was escape. They say wealth brings peace. But peace is not always soft sheets or stuffed pillows. Peace is the sound of someone breathing next to you. Peace is the knowledge that even if the roof leaks, the people beneath it are warm. In the village, there was a lullaby that no one wrote down. It passed from lips to ears for generations, changing slightly each time. A song of rivers and fields and stars that stayed in the sky no matter how many nights passed. A mother hummed it now, as her child's eyelids fluttered. Her voice cracked on one note. She kept going. In the castle there was music too, a harp in a far room, played by someone paid to stay up longer than they should. The sound echoed off the walls and meant nothing to anyone but the player, and, still, it filled the silence. Eventually everyone slept. The king, the cook, the farmer, the thief, the baby, the guards, all folded by the same darkness, all covered by the same quiet sky. And while some slept in straw and others in silk, the dreams that came knew no difference, because in sleep there were no crowns, only breath, only warmth. Only the soft surrender of another day survived. There were games played in every corner of the kingdom. Some were carved in ivory, others drawn in dust with a stick. In the castle, the game was war. Chessboards, as wide as dinner tables, with pieces carved from bone and precious stone. The king held a goblet while moving knights across the board, armies in miniature, battles simulated with quiet strategy. No blood, no cries, just calculation. He played to win, though no one ever dared beat him. In the village, a boy crouched near the fire, drawing circles in the ash. Pebbles stood in for soldiers, a stick for a sword. His sister watched, arms crossed, unimpressed by the rules he made up as he went. But she played anyway, because play was precious and rare. They called it a game, but it was practice, for growing up too fast. The noble taught his son how to plan, how to conquer. "Look 2 moves ahead," he said, tapping the board. "Sacrifice the pawn if it wins the war." The boy nodded, though he didn't understand. Not yet. In the village, no one spoke of sacrifice. They just lived it. A girl skipped rope made from braided twine. Her laughter echoed in the alley between huts. She chanted a rhyme passed down through too many mouths to trace, about chickens and frost and someone named Millie who fell in the mud. No one remembered Millie, but everyone knew the song. In the castle, men dueled in courtyards. Swords clashed for sport, watched by those who would never bleed. A dropped blade was met with polite applause, a bruise with a frown. "Don't let it scar," someone would say. Scars were not fashionable. In the village, scars were proof you'd been there. Children wrestled in the fields, clothes torn, faces streaked with mud. The winner was the one who got up laughing. The prize? Bragging rights. And maybe the last. Piece of bread. Games of wood and dirt. Games without rules. Games that ended not with a victor, but when the sun disappeared. Sometimes they played house. Sometimes funeral, mimicking what they saw, what they feared, what they would one day become. A boy once placed a bowl on his head and declared himself king. His friends bowed dramatically before pelting him with clumps of grass. He laughed until he cried. In that moment, he ruled more truly than the man in the castle ever did, because joy is not a performance, it's presence. The noblewoman played music with her tutor, scales and songs meant to charm, to impress. Her fingers moved precisely, but her heart was not in the room. In the village, music came from spoons on pots, from voices overlapping, from someone drumming their heels on the floor while another clapped. Offbeat, glorious. No gold was given for talent, no reward for harmony. But the joy lasted longer. Not all games were kind. In both worlds, children tested each other, took turns being cruel, being brave, being too much. A slap, a dare, a secret whispered, then betrayed. Even in play, people reveal themselves. But then came forgiveness, a mumbled apology, a hug too tight, a flower left on a windowsill, because forgiveness too was a game, one worth learning young. In the castle, the king played politics like chess, never seeing the faces of the pawns he moved. In the village, the child who lost a game simply asked, "Wanna play again?" And they did, because play was not about winning, it was about belonging. The day would come when games would stop, when the stick became a scythe, when the rope was used to tie a gate shut, not jump, when laughter became quieter and pretending felt silly. But not yet. Not while there was light in the sky. Not while someone was still drawing circles in the dirt. Prayer sounded different, depending on where you stood. In the cathedral it echoed, vaulted and grand, stretched across stained glass and marble floors. A noble knelt on a velvet cushion, spine straight, words rehearsed. A priest nearby chanted in Latin, his voice heavy with incense and ritual. The noble's hands were clasped, his head bowed, but his eyes wandered. He was not thinking of salvation. He was thinking of debts, of sons, of land, of silence dressed as holiness. In the village there was no cathedral, just a wooden cross above a crooked doorway and faith that fit between chores. Prayer was not ceremony. It was muttered while kneading dough, whispered while stitching a wound, thought, but never spoken while burying a child. A woman stood beside her hearth and stared into the flames. Her lips moved, but no sound came. She prayed not for glory, not even for forgiveness. She prayed for enough. Enough food, enough time, enough strength to make it through one more day. Her God did not wear gold. He wore soot. He sat beside her in the night and didn't mind that she hadn't washed her face before asking for help. In the castle, the chapel smelled of rose oil and dust. Candles stood in neat rows. A noblewoman lit one, her hands trembling, not from reverence but from remembering. She prayed, not because she believed fully, but because she didn't know what else to do. It had been a long time since anyone answered. In the village, prayer came when things broke. A father knelt beside a sick child, face buried in a quilt made from his mother's dress. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Sometimes a boy stood outside the church and traced the carved wood of the door, unsure whether to go in. Inside it was cold, but safe. The candles flickered like tiny hearts. The priest didn't ask questions. That too was a kind of mercy. They didn't have hymnals, but they had songs, hummed in the fields, sung to babies, passed between generations, like secrets. They didn't have saints in glass cases, but they had grandmothers with eyes like sky and hands that knew the shape of blessing better than any bishop. Prayer was not a place. It was a rhythm. It lived in the body, in the way someone stirred soup and tasted it with closed eyes, in the way someone placed their palm gently on another's forehead, in the pause before a door was opened or shut. It was in the words said to animals before they were slaughtered, in the way bread was broken and passed without pride, in the way people looked at the stars and whispered promises, knowing full well the sky might never answer. A noble prayed with words written by someone else. The poor prayed with words they made up or none at all, but both prayed, because fear visits everyone and hope is too stubborn to care about class. In the cathedral, a boy lit a candle for someone he missed. He didn't tell anyone, just watched the flame until it blurred. In the cottage, a girl carved a small symbol into the wall with her fingernail. She didn't know why, but it felt like a shield. The noble sought miracles, the peasant sought mercy, and somewhere in the space between those prayers, between the polished pews and the crumbling floorboards, was something that listened, or maybe not, maybe no one heard, but they prayed anyway, because it filled the silence, because it gave shape to sorrow, because it reminded them they were still alive. Pain was never distant. It lived in the mouth, the joints, the belly. It came early and stayed late. In both village and castle, no one lived untouched, but not all pain was treated equally. In the peasant's hut, a man rubbed his jaw with the heel of his hand. A tooth had turned black. He couldn't remember when it started hurting, just that the ache had spread. Now it crept into his ear, into his sleep, into his temper. There was no doctor, just an old woman with a dull knife and a bottle of something strong. She didn't ask for thanks, only quiet, and so he bit down on a rag and didn't scream. In the castle, pain was dressed in finer robes. When the noble's tooth began to throb, a surgeon was summoned. Not a doctor exactly, but someone who knew what herbs to apply, what leeches to place, what prayers to mumble. The tooth was wrapped in linen soaked in clove oil. The pain stayed, but no one dared say that. Because suffering in court was something to be concealed, like poverty or longing. In the village, no one had the luxury of hiding it. A woman gave birth with only her sister present. The screams echoed into the rafters, and no one apologized. A boy burned his hand on a kettle and ran barefoot into the frost to cool it. A girl scraped her knee and kept walking. Pain was stitched into the rhythm of things. It was not questioned, just carried. In the manor, women whispered about female complaints behind fans. Boys were taught not to cry. A nobleman, struck by fever, lay sweating under layers of fur, tended by silent hands. He hallucinated his father's face in the shadows. He wept alone. A peasant woman with a crooked back smiled as she stirred the pot. Not because she was happy, but because the child beside her was. She winced with every step, but she had learned long ago that no one was coming to save her body. so she saved others instead. Teeth fell out. Wounds festered, knees ached, bellies bloated, and through it all life continued because it had to. Pain didn't pause for mourning, or hunger, or winter. In the castle they measured time in calendars, in saints' days and royal births. In the village they measured it in joints, when the ankle stopped bending, when the knuckles stiffened, when the back no longer straightened in the morning. That was how one knew they were aging, not by counting birthdays, but by how long it took to get out of bed. Children learned early to bear pain without complaint. Her stubbed toe got a nod. A fever meant a wet cloth. But tears were not indulgent, they were rationed. Suffering was a quiet thing, a thing folded away. And yet, even pain had moments of poetry. A mother rubbing oil into her daughter's scalp. Even as her own wrist throbbed. A grandfather walking the long way home so his limp wouldn't show. A boy breaking into laughter between coughs, because suffering was not the end of joy. Only its shadow, and the shadow only comes when there's light. In the castle they feared pain because it reminded them of death. In the village, they accepted pain because it reminded them of life. Both hurt, both healed, slowly, unevenly, and neither ever forgot, because pain leaves behind memory, not always sharp, not always cruel, but deep. A map beneath the skin, a record without ink. Even a king itches. Even beneath a golden crown, even behind brocade and velvet, there is skin. And skin, when left too long unwashed, will rebel. In the village it was expected. Itching was as common as hunger. Lice lived in every bed. Fleas danced through hay like confetti. A mother would comb through her daughter's scalp with a broken toothed comb, her fingers moving with the rhythm of someone who had done this too many times to count. She would murmur, "Hold still, love," and the girl would. Not because it hurt, but because it felt like care. In the castle, they pretended it didn't exist. Powder was applied. Perfume dabbed at the wrists and behind the ears. But under the silks and furs the body knew. The skin prickled, the scalp tightened. The noble scratched with a sigh he hoped no one heard. There are things power cannot protect you from. The peasants joked about it, called lice guests, called fleas cousins. A boy might name one after a priest. Humor made the discomfort manageable. And besides, the itching meant you were still alive, still worth biting. They slept in straw, after all. Straw that had sheltered mice, cats, chickens, and worse. They shared beds, blankets, air. The creatures didn't ask permission, they simply arrived. And so the villagers scratched, casually, constantly, a tug at the collar, a dig at the ankle. It was part of the music of daily life. Itch, scratch, sigh, repeat. In the manner, scratching was unseemly. A noblewoman might sit perfectly still as a tickle crept down her spine. Her face would remain smooth, but her hand would twitch. Later she'd send for her maid and whisper that her sheets felt unsettling. The maid would nod, but she would know, because she had washed those sheets, and her hands, red from scrubbing, had itched too. There were powders for this, ointments, salves made from rose and vinegar, and herbs no one could name. In the village there was soap made from lard and ash, harsh but honest. It burned away the worst of it sometimes. A child once asked, "Why do they bite me but not the cat?" His mother replied, "Because you're sweeter." He smiled, scratched, ran outside barefoot. In the castle they believed they were cleaner, but they were not. Parasites do not respect wealth. They hide in the folds of dresses worn once and returned, to closets, in the wigs powdered and perched high, then forgotten, in the rugs where dogs lay, in the walls where servants slept. A king once paused mid-speech, a sudden itch flaring behind his ear. He reached up, scratched, then froze. His counsel stared. He cleared his throat and continued. But someone noticed. Someone always notices. In the village, no one cared. Scratching was a kind of honesty. It said, "I work." It said, "I sweat." It said, "I share space with others, and yes, we have fleas." There was shame, yes, but only when others pointed, only when the itching became too much, too raw, when the scalp bled. When the baby cried through the night, then came the rinses, the stripping of beds, the boiling of water. The fight began again. And still, they lived. The itch was annoying, but survivable. In a world where so much pain could not be soothed, the itch was a small thing, something to do with your hands, something to blame for the restlessness that never left. A noblewoman once whispered to her maid, "I feel something crawling." The maid said nothing, only handed her a lavender sachet. But later, when alone, the maid scratched at her own skin, harder than she should have. And so, under lace and linen, under crowns and wool caps, everyone scratched, because no one escapes. The body, and the body, no matter how adorned, will always itch. It always began the same way, with light, with warmth, with the hopeful crackle of something living in the hearth. Fire was never just fire. It was safety. It was presence. It was the only thing that made the night less cruel. In the village, someone rose early to coax it back to life, blowing on embers like they were infants. A flicker, a spark, and then, if they were lucky, a flame. It wasn't a matter of convenience. It was survival. Without it, the water stayed frozen, the stew stayed raw, and the air never softened. A mother hovered near the hearth, rubbing her hands over the glow. Her fingers were red and cracked, but she whispered to the fire like it could. "Hear her. Just one more hour," she said. "Stay with us." The logs were few, twigs bundled with string, a bit of dried dung, sometimes a broken chair. Fire didn't care where it came from. It burned what it was given. In the castle, the fire roared. Servants kept it fed constantly. One to stoke, another to fetch wood, a third to sweep the ashes before anyone noticed their presence. The noble never saw it born, never watched it struggle into life. He only knew it in full bloom. But even great fires die. Even behind marble, even in rooms with tapestries thicker than cloaks, cold came creeping in when the flames grew low, and cold once invited was hard to send away. In the village, the fire's death was a ceremony, not loud but felt. Children curled tighter. The dog whined softly. Breath became visible. There were no more logs, just prayers. Sometimes someone offered their own warmth, arms around shoulders, feet pressed against legs. Not much, but it mattered. In the castle, the fire's fading was an inconvenience. A bell was rung. Someone hurried in, wood returned, flame restored, but even so, the room never felt quite the same after the first flame went out. There was something lonely in that pause, something that couldn't be rekindled with pine or ash. A peasant once sat watching the glow fade into embers. He didn't move, just stared. Not because he was cold, but because the fire had been the only voice in the room. When it died, so did the company. Flame flickered like thought, alive, dancing, unpredictable. It lit faces from below, making even joy look haunted. It turned walls orange and shadows deep. It crackled and hissed and muttered things only the oldest in the room could understand. In the noble's hall, candles lined the walls. Chandeliers held dozens, maybe hundreds. But it wasn't the same. Candles didn't speak the way a fire did. They didn't gather people. They didn't warm more than a finger's width of air. A fire, even small, had gravity. It pulled people in, made them tell stories, made them stare into it like it might answer back. And when it died too soon, the silence. Left behind was not quiet. It was hollow. A child once cried when the fire went out, not from fear, from mourning. The light had been her only comfort, her only friend. She didn't understand why it had to leave. Her father said nothing, just held her. And together, they watched the dark reclaim the room. In the castle, the noble didn't cry, but he did rise from his chair and walk to the window. Outside, the wind moved in the trees like breath. The stars were sharp with cold. He didn't know why, but he missed something. Something older than him. Something simpler. A fire that stayed. A night that didn't feel so vast. And so, whether peasant or king, they all understood that some fires die too soon, that warmth is not promised, and that what you feed your fire, your time, your stories, your silence, determines how long it stays. Not everything is passed down in gold. Most things, quiet things, travel through hands, glances, and the things left behind after someone is no longer there. In the castle, inheritance was ceremony. A parchment read aloud, a crest re-engraved, lands, titles, debt and dignity, all transferred with wax seals and Latin words. A son bowed. A widow wept with perfect posture. The crown never truly sat still. But in the village, inheritance was quieter, stranger, softer. It came without witnesses, without wealth. A wooden spoon worn smooth from years of stirring. A shawl patched a dozen times, still smelling faintly of the person who wrapped it last. A tool, its handle molded to a hand, that no longer grasped it. There were no announcements, only absences. A man died and the chickens still needed feeding. His boots were left by the door for weeks before his daughter finally slipped them on. Too big, but hers now. Inheritance was a blanket tucked in, a name given, a story told again because it mattered that someone remembered. In the castle, absence was political, a power vacuum. Courtiers whispered, flags dipped, mourning clothes were assigned. People spoke in reverent tones, but already their eyes moved elsewhere, toward the next heir, the next move. Grief had rules in noble halls. In the Itadi village, grief had chores. A woman wept while kneading dough. A boy carried water with eyes that didn't blink. A girl tried to laugh because the silence was too loud otherwise. There was no time to pause. The animals would not wait. The stove would not light itself. Still, the dead stayed, in gestures, in recipes that tasted slightly different now, in prayers. That was shorter but said more often. Sometimes a child reached for a hand that wasn't there out of habit. And when their fingers met only air, they didn't cry. They just put their hands back in their lap and stared at the fire, because even absence teaches something. A noble boy inherited a sword he would never wield. It was hung above his bed as a symbol. He was told he was now a man. He didn't feel like one. The sword made his room feel colder. A peasant boy inherited silence. He watched his mother say less each day. He picked up the axe before she asked. He walked where his father once walked, no ceremony. Just footsteps in the same mud. Inheritance wasn't always chosen. Sometimes it was the thing no one wanted, like debt or sorrow or a name that carried more weight than pride. But sometimes it was love, too. A song hummed under breath. A lullaby you didn't realize you knew until the baby was crying. A way of looking at the stars and thinking, not of gods or fate, but of the one who pointed them out to you long ago. In the castle, the heir received a ledger. In the village, the child received a memory, and both tried in their own way to live up to it, one by ruling, the other by remembering. A woman once found a hairpin beneath her bed. It had belonged to her mother. She hadn't thought about her in days. The sight of it made her sit down suddenly. She didn't cry, just held it, turned it over, as if it might tell her what to do next. In that moment, it did. Because inheritance is not always what is given. Sometimes it is what remains. There was always a moment just before sleep or just after waking when the body remembered, a hollow stretch of time, a turning in the gut, a pause before motion. They called it many things, but mostly it was hunger. In the village, hunger arrived like a season, expected, unwelcome, endured. It crept in through empty cupboards, stared from bare bowls, waited in the eyes of children too tired to play. It was quiet, polite at first. Then it gnawed, then it howled. There was no feast to soften its voice, just broth thinned a little more each day, just bread with more air than grain. Just prayers murmured while chewing, as if thanks alone might fill the gap. A mother once told her son to drink water slowly. It would make the belly feel full. He did. And he smiled, not because it worked, but because she was trying. That meant something. In the castle, hunger wore finer clothes. It came with excess, not absence. The nobleman pushed his plate away, appetite gone, though the table was full. He wasn't starving. He was hollow in a different place, one no feast could touch. He hungered for legacy, for control, for something he couldn't name. But hunger is clever. It adapts. The peasants feared famine. It didn't just mean less. It meant none. It meant planting seeds in dry soil and hoping. It meant borrowing from neighbors who had nothing left to lend. It meant slicing one apple 7 ways and pretending it was a treat. There was an hour every evening when everyone waited for food, for news, for the sound of a pot lid being lifted, and sometimes there was nothing, just the fire, just the wait. In the manor, meals were announced. Courses marched in like soldiers, but even there someone at the edge of the hall held back. A servant who hadn't eaten since dawn, a girl who brushed crumbs from a plate before sneaking it away to share with a sibling waiting outside. Hunger made people resourceful and resentful. It was the great leveler and the great divider. A noble might dream of control, but hunger never obeyed. It came for him on sleepless nights, when the candle flickered and the silence grew bold, when memory tasted like burnt bread and fear like bitterness, when he remembered, dimly, that his grandfather once starved a province into obedience, and the land still hadn't forgiven him. The villagers did not starve in silence. Their stomachs spoke. So did their eyes. A woman once traded her wedding cloth for flour. She didn't look back. A man stole a potato and returned 3 nights later to offer firewood in apology. Hunger twisted morality, but didn't always break it. Children played games pretending they were full. They fed dolls imaginary pies. They asked what roast pheasant tasted like, though they'd never seen one. A father described it anyway. He'd never tasted it either. In the chapel they prayed not for abundance, but for enough. Enough to sleep without pain, enough to wake without panic, enough to know their children would live. The king prayed too, but for different things, that the grain would arrive, that the rebellion wouldn't spread, that the next banquet wouldn't feel so hollow, that the wine would taste sweet again. But no prayer filled an empty stomach. Only food could do that, and food was scarce, and winter was long, and hunger, like the wind, did not care about rank. It blew into every room, lifted every curtain, and sat at every table, sometimes invisible, sometimes undeniable, always waiting. They lived between 2 seasons, feast and famine, and sometimes somehow they lived in both at once. In the village, the festival came like sunlight through storm clouds, rare, warm, brief, a moment carved, out of hardship and stitched together with laughter, fire, and the smell of something sweet on the air. People danced, not because they had strength, but because they needed to remember what it felt like to move freely. A fiddler with cracked hands played a song too fast for old knees and just right for bare feet. Children ran in crooked circles, chasing each other between skirts and goats. Someone roasted a turnip and called it a delicacy. No one corrected them, because joy, when it appeared, was sacred, even if it wore rags. In the castle, festivals were calculated. Gold-draped affairs with roasted swans, banners unfurled, and speeches longer than the food line. Nobles smiled with their mouths, but rarely their eyes. A celebration was not for joy, it was for display. It was proof that things were fine, even when they weren't. The noble raised his goblet to the crowd and toasted to the harvest. Outside the gates, that same harvest had failed. In the village, famine was not an idea. It was the empty side of the bed where someone used to sleep. It was the pot that didn't boil. It was the silence at supper. A woman once danced at the spring festival and buried her husband 2 weeks later from hunger. She wore the same dress to both. There was no time for costume changes. Still, the festival returned each year, stubbornly, because joy did not wait for permission. In famine, people grew quiet. They stopped measuring days and began measuring bites. Meals became smaller and conversations thinner. But when the festival came, just for a night, they ate like they'd never go hungry again. Bread was shared without counting. Wine was passed with both hands. A girl placed flowers in her sister's hair and forgot just briefly that their garden had died. In the castle, a juggler performed tricks in the great hall. Coins clinked into his hat, tossed carelessly by men who had never wanted for bread. Behind the tapestries, servants waited for leftovers. They never came. Famine, for them, was hidden behind closed doors. behind the kind of hunger that made you steal cheese when no one was looking, behind servants dismissed so they wouldn't die where guests could see them. The nobles talked of shortages. The villagers talked of who's still left. One year, a village held no festival. The sickness had taken too many. But on that same day, a boy found a dusty drum in the attic and tapped it with his finger until his mother smiled. It was enough, because even a heartbeat can sound like celebration when you need it to. The line between feast and famine was never clear as one night of full bellies, followed by weeks of tightening belts, a wedding followed by a funeral, a laugh right next to a prayer. In the village, joy was not separate from sorrow. It grew from it, like a flower through a crack in the wall. In the castle, joy was separated from sorrow by walls, titles, and distance, but sorrow seeped in anyway. A nobleman once sat through a banquet and felt nothing. Not from lack, but from too much. Too many courses, too many toasts, too many masks. He envied the peasant who laughed with his mouth full of roots, because joy that costs nothing stays longer. So the festival returned, year after year, and the famine followed like a shadow. And still they danced, because to dance in the face of emptiness was the bravest kind of survival. Justice, like bread, was never evenly divided. In the castle it came dressed in robes, heavy with gold, thread, pronounced in polished Latin behind carved wooden benches. A noble sat in judgment, high above, chin tilted just enough to suggest he was looking down, at the law, at the accused, at the world. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. In the village, punishment didn't come with robes, it came with rumors, with eyes that stopped meeting yours, with fences that didn't open when you knocked, and sometimes when the harvest failed or tempers flared, it came with rope. The peasant feared many things, but few more than being seen, to be seen too much, to be seen in the wrong place, to be seen with the wrong hands in the wrong sack of barley, because punishment was swift when you had no title. A man once stole a loaf of bread, not because he wanted it, but because he had no other choice. His daughter hadn't eaten in 2 days. He didn't run. He stood in the square, surrounded by neighbors who said nothing, though their stomachs grumbled too. He was tied to the post, lashed, then left. The noble, watching from afar, called it justice. The villagers called it something else. In the castle, crimes were committed behind silk curtains, a debt erased, a rival discredited, a servant discarded. No lashes, no rope, only silence. And silence there was the most dangerous punishment of all, because to be forgotten was worse than to be beaten. In the village, everyone remembered. They remembered the woman who had shouted at the landlord, the boy who stole the priest's boots, the girl who ran off and came back with no ring and no child. Punishment came in whispers, in empty chairs, in cold stares across crowded rooms. It wasn't written, but it lasted longer. Power was a kind of protection. If you owned enough land, enough names, enough favors, you could bend the law without breaking it. If you were poor, even breathing too loudly near the wrong man could be a crime. Still, not all punishment came from lords. Sometimes it came from the land, from frost, from blight, from a cow that stopped giving milk, from a well that turned sour. The villagers understood that justice was not always human, that sometimes suffering arrived with no judge at all. But when it was a man, when the crown turned its eye on you, there was nowhere to run. Stocks were built in the middle of the square. A child once asked why they had holes in them. His mother didn't answer, because some lessons are learned by watching, and some by kneeling. Even children knew the rules. Speak softly. Don't look a noble in the eye. Don't take what you can't. Hide. Don't be too clever. Don't be too slow. Don't be too anything. In the castle, nobles paid poets to praise them, paid artists to paint them, paid soldiers to protect them, but fear was the currency of the poor. It bought silence, obedience, restraint, and sometimes, when shared carefully, it bought mercy, because even punishment, when looked at closely, is a kind of story, and stories can be rewritten. A woman once stood between a soldier and her son, said nothing, just stood. The soldier paused and left. Not because she was powerful, but because some punishments, when stared down, shrink, and some people, no matter how small, carry justice in their spine. They said he died peacefully, that the king, wrapped in velvet and surrounded by candles, passed into the next world with dignity. A servant found him before dawn, still and pale, as if merely resting between declarations. But even kings sleep cold, especially at the end. In the village, death came without candles. It came in the dark, beneath leaking roofs, beside hearths long gone out. It came with no trumpet, no Latin, no feast. Just breath. That didn't return. A man died on a straw bed beside his wife. She didn't wake until the morning light caught the stillness in his chest. She didn't cry right away. She simply laid a hand over his and whispered his name. Once, the silence answered. In the castle, silence was not allowed. At the king's death, bells rang, garments were blackened, proclamations delivered. But beneath all of it, beneath the gold-threaded shroud and the polished stone, he was alone. The ice, same way the peasant had been. For all his power, he couldn't take warmth with him. The velvet turned cold. The marble grew colder. And the fire, so carefully maintained for so many years, sputtered in its grate as if unsure who to warm now. In the village, the dead were carried with bare hands. Neighbors took turns lifting the wooden plank that bore the body. No priest needed, no declarations, just shared memory and soil that gave back nothing. Children asked questions. Where did he go? Will he be cold? Is he with the stars? Their mother said, He's where the fire always stays lit. No one asked more. A king's body was never touched by common hands. Attendants bathed him, dressed him, arranged him, but none of them looked into his eyes, because death, even for kings, was too real. In the end, the crown rested at his feet, too heavy for the head now. Too late. A woman in the village whispered once, The king dies and so do we. Only the prayers are different. She was right. The prayers for the peasant were soft, private, spoken between spoonfuls of broth and unfinished chores. The prayers for the king were written, performed, echoed in stone. But neither man heard them, and neither returned. In both homes something shifted. A chair left empty, a cup left untouched, a quiet that lasted longer than it should, and in both homes the living carried on. Because they had to. The nobleman's son was crowned before the wax cooled. The peasants buried their dead before the ground froze. There was no waiting, only the cold. A servant once stood near the king's chamber the night after his death. The fire had gone out. She wanted to relight it, but something stopped her. Instead, she wrapped her shawl tighter and whispered, Sleep well. In a hut miles away, a boy woke in the middle of the night and reached for his grandfather, forgetting. His hand met nothing. And yet, somehow, warmth lingered. Because sometimes warmth does not leave with the body. Sometimes it stays in the room, in the blanket folded by habit, in the seat no one dares to take, in the way the light catches the edge of the doorway just like it used to. So yes, the king slept cold, but so did the poor. So did the good. So did the cruel. So did the quiet. So did we all. And maybe the final truth was this, that no matter how high your bed, how deep your stone, or how loud the bells, in the end, all fires fade, and we all sleep under the same silence. They never met the king and the peasant, one ruled by decree, the other by dawn. One wore fur-lined cloaks, the other patched linen, stiff with ash and sweat. One was sung about, the other forgotten before the year's end. And yet, each night, they lay beneath the same stars. Stars do not ask who you are. They do not pause, hover palaces or hurry past hovels. They shine for everyone equally, indifferently, soft and silver like a promise no one remembers making. In the village, a child pointed up at the sky and asked her mother what they were. Stories, she whispered. Stories that forgot their endings. The king once gazed from his tower, wine in hand, and tried to recall the name of a single constellation. He couldn't, but he stared anyway, because something in the dark made him feel less alone. Above both roofs, slate and straw, The stars blinked like tired eyes, watching, waiting, and below them, and people did what they'd always done. They loved, they hurt, they labored, they sang, they lied, they forgave. They woke before the sun and slept long after the fires died. They whispered names into pillows, into earth, into the ears of children, too young to remember but old enough to carry. In the castle, the next king was crowned. The bells rang, the people watched. In the village, a girl learned to knead dough. Her mother corrected her gently, again and again, until she got it right. That, too, was a kind of coronation, because legacy isn't just passed in blood or ink. Sometimes it's in the way a door creaks, the rhythm of sweeping, the pause before someone answers, the lullaby that never changes, even when the singer does. They were different, yes, the king and the peasant. One bathed in rosewater, the other in silence. One held a scepter, the other a scythe, but both had scars. Both had moments where they wondered if they'd done enough. Both feared the cold more than death, and both, when alone, prayed for peace, whether to saints carved in gold or to stars that didn't answer. Maybe that's why the stars mattered, because they didn't listen. They simply stayed. In the quiet, they reminded the people below that someone else had once stood in the same spot and looked up, just as tired, just as small. A king once stood barefoot on the balcony, crown beside him, and whispered, "Is this?" All a peasant once stood barefoot in a field, hands caked in soil, and whispered the same thing. Different mouths, same words. That's how you know something's true. In time, the castle crumbled, the stones stolen, repurposed, turned into stables, schools, silence. The village shifted too. Names changed, roofs collapsed, roots grew through floorboards. But still, the stars stayed. Still they watched. And beneath them, someone lit a fire. Someone sang a song. Someone whispered to a sleeping child, "You are safe." That was always the hope, not wealth, not glory, not even survival. Just the smallest, quietest kind of warmth, the kind you pass from one person to the next like a flame cupped in your hands. And as long as someone holds it, gently, carefully, the darkness never fully wins. So maybe in the end, the difference between the crown and the crust wasn't so wide after all. Maybe what mattered was not how they lived apart, but how they dreamed under the same stars. If you're still here, tucked beneath the covers, thank you for walking through the cold and quiet of history with me. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing, only if it feels right. Sleep well. You are not alone. The stars are still watching.